Good evening, everyone. It's really good to be back with you again. And tonight I have definitely one of my favorite people and someone that everyone should follow, particularly at your Substack. Alex Krainer, welcome back. We haven't had a talk for a little while, actually.
Well, thank you for having me, Vanessa. Always a pleasure. And I think, time seems to have accelerated.
Yes.
So to me, it feels like we spoke just a couple of weeks ago.
Well, I mean, I know we follow each other on social media, and that it's one of the positives of social media is that it does
Yes.
allow you to kind of virtually follow people and see what they're up to. So yeah, and I follow what you write on Substack, and as I said, I recommend everybody. Can you just remind people of the name, the address of your Substack, and also just quickly talk about the book you wrote on Browder?
Yes, my Substack is called Alex Krainer's Trend Compass, and I think the address is alexkrainer.substack.com, something like that. Mm-hmm. And then I'm on Twitter. My handle is @nakedhedgie. And my book, it's been banned since forever, so it can only be bought from the pages of my publisher, the Red Pill Press. It's called Grand Deception.
Mm-hmm. And that's about the Bill Browder fraud, right?
That's about the Bill Browder fraud, yeah. Not a household name, but very significant because that's pretty much how the Western proxy war against Russia got hotted up over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, and if anybody needs the website, they can get in touch with you. I can let them know how to, etc. And I do highly recommend it. Alex, this evening we were just chatting before I started recording. I wanted to talk to you about, everybody's talking about the military war, the expansion of the military war between Israel and Palestine to include Lebanon. It already includes Syria, of course, and has done for the past 11 years, and eventually Iran. And so everyone's very focused on that military war, but I want to try and talk about what I would describe as the multi-spectrum war, because in my opinion, the war that the resistance axis, and of course that includes non-state actors in Iraq, in Lebanon, although Hezbollah does have connections, of course, to the government, the coalition government in Lebanon, Ansarullah in Yemen, Iran, and Syria. And they have been waging it. It goes beyond a military war, in my opinion. It has gone into a hybrid war, into a multi-spectrum war, which is affecting the economy of Israel, but also I want to look at how it's affecting the allies of Israel in the West. Do you agree that this war is more complex than it is being portrayed in the media, of course?
Yes, certainly. There's no doubt about it. This is what Croatia's Admiral Domazet has called global total war. And he didn't choose that term, by accident. He, in fact, corrected an interviewer who asked him about it. And the interviewer said, well, would you think that we are in World War III? And he said, no, this is not a world war. This is a global total war, which is a step up from a world war, because as you rightly mentioned, it's a multi-spectrum war. It's being waged not only on geographical places and nations like Russia and Syria and Libya and Iraq and Iran and so forth and China, but it is also being waged in many different ways: financial, economic war, cultural wars. And it is also being waged on the people of the nations that are the perpetrators of this war, meaning the American people, the British people, the French people, the German people, the Polish people, and so forth. So it's a total conflict between, and this is important to understand, it's not a conflict between one nation and the next nation. It's as these people who are in charge of the Western establishment tell us, notably George Soros, but some others as well, it's a conflict between two systems of governance. And the two systems of governance need to be understood as the Western imperialistic, oligarchic system of governance, colonialist system of governments, versus pretty much the whole entire rest of the humanity, whether we're talking about different countries, different regions, different alliances, or whether we're talking about the populations of countries that live in those places, as well as the populations that live in Western nations. And we see that, which, we've had the pandemic, we had the push for mandatory vaccinations. We have every so often a new pandemic or epidemic declared. We have these cultural wars where they're pushing these LGBT agendas on us. Now they are stepping up very aggressively censorship and limiting people's freedom of movement, freedom of gathering, protesting, and so forth. So it's not many different conflicts. It's all the same conflict that has many different manifestations. As you said, a multi-spectrum war.
Yeah. And you were talking, and I'd like to bring you in on that. You were talking that you were basically saying that you had been following very closely what had been going on in the UK for the last couple of months. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Yes. So, if you read the newspapers, you came across the news that there was this lethal stabbing in Southport, UK, where three young girls were killed. And initially they said, it was a Muslim who did it, which wasn't true. Yeah. And then from there, things started kind of getting really bad. There were all these riots and clashes between supposedly the Muslim immigrant community and the these, I don't know what to call them, white British patriotic reaction to this, what Keir Starmer called right-wing thugs, right? But what got my attention is I was listening to one of Alexander Mercouris's podcast, and he said, well, everything looks fine and calm in London. And he said, I called my friends around the country, and everybody's telling me it's calm there too, even for places where they reported these, these riots.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, that's funny, why would the government be exaggerating something if it's not quite the way they say it, And then, obviously the reason is because they want to justify a crackdown. And we did have a very draconian crackdown. I mean, the way the rhetoric in the United Kingdom has turned suddenly like the movie plot from V for Vendetta, the 2005 dystopian sci-fi plot that took place in England. And then a few days later, I was on a podcast with Tom Longo, and we were kind of brainstorming about what is going on. Why would they be doing this, and why now? And then, the thinking converged, it must be a financial crisis. And so I started looking into that. And sure enough, the writing's really on the wall. So here's what's been happening, Britain, but, Britain is only one of the nations, but I think it's the heaviest, it has the heaviest involvement. Britain is heavily involved in Ukraine, and things in Ukraine are going very badly. Ukraine owes about something over $160 billion in foreign debt. And there's this $20 billion tranche that is owed to private bondholders. And 2 years ago, when the war started, this deal was made in the summer 2022, they gave Ukraine a grace period of 2 years to freeze the debt repayments. That grace period expired on the 1st of August. Wow. And in the run-up to this, there's been a whole flurry of activity between 12 July and 19th July. There have been these negotiations between the Ukrainian government and a committee of these bondholders. And the Ukrainian government was asking for a 60% debt reduction, and the bondholders were offering 22%. And then finally, on the 19th of July, they settled on 37% haircut for the investors. But this was just a preliminary agreement with this committee of bondholders. It's not like every bondholder agreed to this. So this preliminary agreement imposed on Ukraine to go and basically seek debt restructuring from these bondholders, to go to these bondholders and beg for them to accept this deal. Well, they didn't do this. What they did instead is that on 31 July this summer, so 2 days before the grace period will expire, Volodymyr Zelensky signs a decree saying, like, okay, we're not going to be paying back these debts for the next 2 months, or some reports said 3 months. Then all of this, what happened on the 18th July and 19th July, Volodymyr Zelensky was in London. And first he met with his ambassador there, who was Valery Zaluzhny, the former commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And then he participated in some summit of something called European Political Community. I don't know what this is, but allegedly there were delegates of 44 different European countries, and they concluded that summit with a decision to start to attack a Russian fleet, a shadow fleet of these oil tankers that were helping Russia evade Western sanctions. Okay, that's the information we have. Then the next day, Zelensky had a meeting with Keir Starmer's cabinet. He was invited to give a speech to the cabinet, which was the first time this happened since 1997, when Bill Clinton addressed Tony Blair's cabinet. So it's a very, very rare honor and a privilege for a statesman of another nation to address the British cabinet. Mm. And then they apparently concluded this bondholder deal that just a few days later, Volodymyr Zelensky reneged on by decreeing a one-sided freeze of debt repayments. Another thing that happened 2 days after the Ukrainians announced this deal, because, okay, so the deal was apparently reached on the 19th July. That was a Friday. 22 July, Monday, Ukrainian government makes a press release and saying, like, okay, so we've reached this deal, everything is okay, don't nobody worry about Ukraine's debt. And then 2 days later, Fitch Ratings downgrades Ukraine's debt from CC to C. And their C rating is, well, there's two things about this. It's very rare because it reflects that the country is already in the process of default. So Fitch basically says Ukraine's defaulting. And then another thing is that, normally these ratings agencies have a set protocols for reviewing countries' credit rating. And there's a planned schedule for this. And Ukraine's credit review was due on 6th December of this year. Mm. And instead, Fitch brought it forward by nearly 6 months. And so the question is why? And, Fitch says, like, well, it would have been inappropriate for us to wait because there was a material deterioration of Ukraine's financial position. But I suspect also that, somebody somewhere with the power to pull strings did this deliberately in order to push Ukraine under the bus and the UK and Europe along with them, because they want this thing to end. They want it over. And so, we have Ukraine in default. And Britain's position here is very desperate because Britain has been the main cheerleader for war in Ukraine. And they have provided very close to $10 billion in military aid, something like $7.5 billion in financial aid. Britain has also guaranteed multiple tranches of World Bank loans to Ukraine. And then there's a whole slew of private financial institutions that have bought Ukraine's debt. So and then that's the direct investment. But there's also, they imposed something like 2,000 sanctions against individuals and the various entities in Russia, and Russia has reciprocated. So British economy has sustained very heavy damage. They basically went all in on this project Ukraine. It was betting the ranch that Ukraine will win, except Ukraine is not winning. So apparently, there was a little bit of a panic in the British establishment. And then on that very same 22 July, when this bond deal was announced, funny enough, Bank of England announced some kind of a conference, symposium, where one of their director of market operations gave a speech. Her name was Saporta, I think Victoria Saporta or Veronica, I forget. And the title of her speech was "Let's get ready to repo." And I don't know if you remember the 2019 repo crisis.
Yeah.
Basically, the implication, if you're going for repo, for opening up the repo facilities to your financial institutions, and who knows, who else, you're signaling to the markets that one of your banks, at least one or more of your banks, are on the verge of collapsing. And British financial system is it's not very, very extensive, in the sense that you don't have thousands of small banks in Britain. You have pretty much 90% of all deposits are with the big five.
Yeah.
So if one of those big five goes down, they all go down. And that could be a collapse of the British economy and financial system. So, clearly, to preempt this, they are launching this repo program. But what that means is basically that they will allow their banks to post any kind of toxic sludge as collateral in exchange for cash. The translation in English is that the Bank of England is getting ready for massive open-ended money printing to prevent the system from seizing up, from the economy grinding to a halt. So the good news, Vanessa, is that we probably won't see like a Lehman Brothers style collapse in England. That one of the banks suddenly goes bankrupt and your money is gone. But on the other hand, they're going to lose control of quantitative easing, of money printing, and that means that in the longer term you're going to have a continued stagnation and an acceleration of consumer price inflation, and you're going to get debasement of the currency, and you're going to probably have a collapse of the price of gilt and a rise in interest rates. And so the point is that the war in Ukraine is not something that's happening 1,000 miles away. The war in Ukraine is coming home to Great Britain. But, it's coming home also to Europe, because France is on the hook in a similar way. Germany is on the hook in a similar way. The banking authorities, the monetary authorities, and the governments are going to be responding pretty much in the same way as the Bank of England and the Keir Starmer cabinet. And then the same thing is probably going to be happening in Japan, in Canada, in Australia as well. And so what that means that we're going to have politically crack down on free speech, freedom of movement. They're going to try to keep us in 15-minute cities. They're going to try to prevent us from protesting what's coming our way, and we're going to have radical decline in the standard of living and in the prosperity. And we've already seen a small preview of this 2 years ago, in 2022, under Liz Truss government.
Yeah.
You know, when Kwasi Kwarteng presented his mini budget,
Yes.
and then what happened is that the gilt, British government bonds sold off sharply because all these pension funds across the UK started to get margin calls, and then they had to sell off their gilts to come up with cash, and then the price of gilt collapsed, and then just a few days into this, so he presented the mini budget, I think, on 20-something September, 22nd September, I think. By 27th September, there were no buyers for gilt. Okay, so the gilts were going to collapse. So the Bank of England had to step in and buy 40 billion pounds worth of gilts. And then the peculiar thing about the British financial system is that any losses that the Bank of England sustains on their balance sheet by holding these government assets or whatever assets they hold, the British Treasury has to reimburse them for those losses. In other words, the British taxpayer has to reimburse them for the losses. And so, I looked at how much money we're talking about, and last tally, in about a year ago, the Bank of England estimated that the British Treasury, His Majesty's Treasury, owed 150 billion pounds to the Bank of England. And so, what's 150 billion pounds? That's about 2,500 pounds per man, woman, and child in Great Britain. Yeah. So that's the ransom that they're holding over the British people. And, that's man, woman, and child, but only about half the population is employed. And only about half of that half is employed in private sector, Yeah. That is, 17% of people in England work for the government, but even in the private sector, many of them work as government contractors because the government share of the GDP is very close to half. Mm-hmm. So this is, in other words, completely impossible and unpayable. And this gamble on Project Ukraine not only didn't succeed, but now it's boomerang back, and the default, Ukraine's default, is now pushing Great Britain onto the road of all these regimes like Zimbabwe and Argentina and so forth, where they have no choice but to print money, debase the currency, and let the inflation loose. So that's what's coming to the British people, thanks to their whole series of governments that have gambled on this Project Ukraine.
Yeah, on Project Ukraine, but then I think also, Britain historically has invested heavily into Israeli security. And that doesn't mean only since October the 7th, but as I said, historically. And if you look at the 2030 roadmap between Israel and the UK, the extent to which Israel is embedded within all sectors of British industry, health, education, cybersecurity, defense, and so on. And in order to maintain the security of Israel, I do think there is a connection, of course, between Ukraine and Israel, and certainly between Ukraine and the Zionist coalition regime that's in power right now. And if you look at what Britain in particular, with the US and the IMF and now the EU, they're also keeping another country afloat in order to preserve the security of Israel, and that's Egypt, who I describe as the Ukraine of West Asia. Because effectively Egypt at any point, I can't remember the exact billions figure that it's in debt for, and of course now Saudi Arabia and UAE are to some degree bailing it out by buying up territory in the Sinai, by building tourist projects and so on. And of course they're all banking on getting their hands on the Palestinian gas, off the coast of Gaza, off the coast of the occupied territories, and off the coast of Lebanon and Syria. And so I think, I agree with you. This is a war between the transnational oligarchy, the neo-colonialists, and the people that don't subscribe to that ideology. But I think it's also a war between the commodity bloc, the commodity axis, the axis that actually has the commodities, and the axis that largely doesn't. And that, of course, is the reason why these nations have been targeted for so long in the global south, and alliances have been made with countries that can provide them with commodities. And so this is also, isn't it, another layer of pressure that's now going to come into play. It already has done through the Ukraine war.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, if you get where I'm going with this.
Yes, I understand it, and you're absolutely right. And I focused on Ukraine because this seems to have been the immediate trigger of many events that have been that have transpired over the last just the last 4 or 5 weeks. But you're absolutely right. Israel has been the project of the British Empire since the get-go, since 1917, since the Balfour Declaration, and the United States has only inherited this project, taking it off of the British hands, but it serves exactly the same purpose.
Yeah.
And it's we find the rationale for it in Mackinder's 1904 treatise, which he titled the Geographical Pivot of History, right? And in that geographical pivot of history, what Mackinder was talking about is how to prevent the land empire that could emerge on the Eurasian landmass from taking power. Because his hypothesis, and it was taken very seriously in the British ruling establishment, was that it was wrong for Britain to focus on just being a naval power, because there is going to be a land power that was going to emerge, and he identified this pivot state, the pivot area, as the place where it would emerge, and it broadly is the area of Caucasus. Iran, Afghanistan, Russia, Kazakhstan, that area. And he identified Russia as the most likely nation that was going to emerge as a big power there. And, that same 1904 is when the Russians completed the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was seen by the British as a big threat, because now this was going to catalyze economic growth. And the British were very worried that this had such massive potential in terms of resources that the wealth of that area, it was going to grow enormously, and then that they were going to be able to allocate all that wealth into building fleets. And so what Mackinder and people around him decided was a way to prevent this pivot state, this land empire, from emerging and becoming a rival to the Western Empire, to the British Empire, was to surround the area with a whole bunch of bridgeheads. And at the time, Israel didn't exist, but Mackinder identified France, Italy, India, Korea, and pretty much those countries as the potential bridgeheads. And then the idea was that these countries should be supplying the land armies to keep this land power, i.e. Russia, constantly at wars. And then that British naval power should be supplying the materials and the armaments to these bridgehead powers to keep Russia constantly in these quagmires all around this inner crescent of his general, how do you call it, geographic conception. So okay, so over the years things changed, but one of the things that they did in 1917 is they started there was the Balfour Declaration, and then they proceeded to create Israel, because Israel was intended as one of these bridgeheads, which was going to allow the empire to keep their hegemony over the Middle East or West Asia. And so, Pakistan was created, and so forth and so on. But all these wars, they're all part of this British geopolitics. These are all tactics and strategies of the British Empire. And so the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, these color revolutions in places like Kazakhstan, Belarus,
Georgia,
Bangladesh now, in Pakistan, the toppling of the Imran Khan's government. And so it's all part of the same thing. It's all part of the same struggle for the hegemony over the Eurasian landmass. And this is explicitly stated in what these people write. And it started off as an obsession of the British Empire, but then it was copy pasted into the American foreign policy. And even to this day, you'll find American officials stating that the most important priority of the American foreign policy is to preserve the hegemony over the Eurasian landmass. And this was stated explicitly as recently as under the Trump administration, even though they then they pull these things off the internet, off of their documents, but this is what they're doing, and this is why we're having all these forever wars always on the Eurasian continent.
In your opinion, though, to what extent do you think the resistance axis is aware, profoundly aware of this strategy with all of its complexities? I mean, there is an impression now that I have, the fact that Yemen with Ansarullah took the decision to effectively blockade the main shipping route, which is impacting economically, not only on Israel, with the now near bankruptcy of Eilat port, according to articles in Israeli media, but it must be having a tremendous impact even on the countries that you're talking about, on Britain, on Germany, on France, on the United States.
Yes, I think that there's no doubt about it. And I have my very strong impression is that these rival powers, these let's call it BRICS nations, Shanghai Cooperation Organizations, that they are perfectly aware of the game, that they perfectly understand what the strategy is, and that they have perfectly understood where the greatest weakness of the Western powers is. And so they're clearly talking to one another. The Russians are talking to the Iranians, they're coordinating and discussing things with the Chinese on a regular basis. I think that the Belarus is on board, Iranian proxies in the region like Iran and Syria, and I think
allies, not proxies, please.
Yeah, sorry. Oh, I apologize. I meant allies. That they are all on board. That they all understand this, and I think that this is why we did not see a direct retaliation by the Iranians for the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, which happened when 30th of July.
Yeah, so 3 weeks.
30th of July, the day before this Ukraine's bond repayments grace period was about to expire. I don't know that these events are related, but they all are related in the sense that they're putting more and more and more pressure on Western governments, because not only are they losing in the geopolitical and military sense, but their economic systems are about to implode, and that includes Iran. Iran is verging on an economic collapse. And, I think just yesterday in Haaretz, one of these Israeli military generals said that if Iran doesn't turn things around in the next several months, that is going to, the whole society is going to collapse. And I think that
Iran or Israel?
Sorry,
I,
Israel. I'm speaking too quickly, and then I'm.
No, it's fine. I was just like, oh, okay.
Israel. Yeah, thank you for
Yeah, but I
correcting.
know the article. It was the head of Shin Bet, actually, one of the intelligence agencies, I think, who was saying that. Yeah.
And so they know that this is coming, and I think that this is why they are so desperate to provoke an escalation. But the reason why they're not getting the escalation, I think, is because the other side exactly understands their weaknesses. And so what we saw in the aftermath of the Ismail Haniyeh assassinations is we saw Syria launch an offensive to recapture their oil-producing regions in the northeast. Around Deir ez-Zor, right? We saw stepped-up attacks by the Ansar Allah against the oil traffic through the Red Sea.
Yeah.
We saw targeted attacks by Hezbollah on Iran, but pinpricks, no massive attack, and so it seems to me that they understood the game, and that they're going to bleed Israel, Ukraine, and their Western allies white until they're so exhausted that they simply collapse and are defeated at home internally.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that is definitely one aspect. I think the other reason that we haven't seen any retaliation yet is because Iran has to prepare itself. Because if it is going to militarily, retaliate at some point, it needs to be prepared for the inevitable response from Israel and its allies. So I think it's a combination of two things. I know from my sources here that all of the other resistance actors are ready to militarily retaliate, but they're waiting to see how Iran wants to play it, right? And of course, what we have seen from Israel, as you rightly pointed out, there has been an escalation. There has been a definite expansion of aggression into Lebanon, even into the northeast on the border with Syria, or close to the border with Syria. A number of occasions they've hit what they've described as weapons transport. In reality, they weren't. They were food and farm produce transport. And they've hit in the Bekaa Valley quite violently recently in the last few days, killing often, many times, mostly civilians, but still targeted assassinations. So they killed a commander in Fatah, in Sidon, in southern Lebanon in the last 2 days. And so Israel, as you've pointed out, that they are consistently trying to expand the war. Because that's what they need, just as the West needs, of course, is to maintain, as you mentioned in the beginning, these forever wars, this perpetual war policy. And I think what's particularly interesting is the amount of military hardware that's been moved into the region. So into the Mediterranean, into the Gulf of Oman, into the Red Sea. I mean, it's like 1/3, it's been reported, of US capability, which is, for me, that's complete insanity. If you look at it from a war strategy point of view, you're putting all of your warcraft in the eye of the storm, and basically they're sitting duck targets now. And I do wonder if that isn't also another part of this plan. right, to draw in all of this hardware where it's very easy for it to be targeted. And they've all got the capability now. I mean, we've even
Yes.
seen Ansarullah target the Eisenhower aircraft
Yes.
carrier, which
Yes.
was, they tried to kind of play that one down. But the fact that they've been moving, you're right, the tribes, it's basically the Syrian tribal factions in the northeast that have been leading attacks against the Kurdish Contras and against US positions, particularly around the Al Omar and the Konoko oil fields. They haven't taken control of the oil fields as of yet because the US is bringing in reinforcements. They've established watchtowers, they're establishing air defense, they're training the Kurds in air defense. So in my opinion, that means the US is preparing for an escalation, for sure. Russia is preparing for an escalation with Iran. I mean, they've been providing the electronic warfare systems, according to fairly reliable reports. And as you said, there is a constant flow of discussion going on between the non-aligned countries. So I think it could be a case of both, of all factors in the hybrid war. So I think it could be the economic factor now, putting the added pressure and also the anticipation of an attack, right? Which is paralyzing everything in Israel and exacerbating the internal divisions and the internal unrest and so on, which, yes. I mean, I guess my fear is we're all talking about this, and meanwhile, Israel is still, well, in fact, it's increasing the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza and in West Bank. So I suppose, it's a very sort of, it's a deadly form of brinkmanship that's kind of going on at the moment, is how I see it.
Yes, I think you're right. But I also think that, the fact of the United States bringing a full 1/3 of their naval power into the region also creates a ripe situation for a false flag attack, because Israelis have submarines. They could attack a carrier strike group and sink it and kill a whole hundreds or maybe thousands of American soldiers. And then they could say like, the Iranians did this.
Yeah,
and
or
I think
Russia,
that another,
or any one of these countries,
Yes. And so then they would have their casus belli. But I think that another danger with retaliation against Israel, which I didn't see discussed much, but I did hear it mentioned, is that these fanatics around Smotrich and Ben, what's his face?
Ben Gvir.
Yes. Ben Gvir might be preparing to use the cover of let's say a large-scale retaliation to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or to try to destroy it, and then to say, "Oh, look, Muslim community, look at what the Iranians have done. Let's all now go and kill Iran together," and then try to bring on board the Saudis and the Turks and all the Egyptians and all the powers in the world, because here's these evil Shia Muslims who destroyed the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So I think
and that also plays into the enmity between the normalized regional states with Israel, which is Saudi Arabia is kind of playing hard to get, but it is effectively normalized. It's certainly a client state of the United States, but you've got UAE, Bahrain, Jordan, Egypt, who are. And I've noticed that there is a new line coming into Israeli media in the last couple of days that if effectively the resistance axis is victorious, then there will be an Iranian outpost in Palestine. So they're already beginning to plant the seed of this danger or this threat for those
Yeah.
regional players. But I think the other big threat, which again, as you mentioned, nobody's really talking about, is the Samsung option. I talked about it in the last couple of days on a number of platforms. That Israel has now, estimations vary between 200 and 400 nuclear warheads that it's been developing for decades.
Yes.
And it also has, as Ariel Sharon described in 2003, this Samson option, where it's prepared to bring the ceiling down on its own head if necessary to prevent the fall of Israel. And so there is a very big potential for Israel to preemptively strike with a tactical nuke, whether it's in response to a false flag, which I think is also extremely likely, or whether it will do it simply to prevent its ruination, which economically, as you mentioned, is kind of the writing on the wall, right?
Yes. Yes.
So I sort of think we've got a number of threats, potential threats in the next few months.
Yes. Yes. Correct. And every single one of them could be a point of escalation. And I think it's extremely important to understand the nature of the game. And I take some, let's say, solace from the fact that it seems to me that the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese are playing their hand very, very wisely.
Yeah.
And that they're not falling into provocations, that they're not rushing out. And I think that they're simply looking to give Israel and Ukraine and other Western powers enough rope so that in due course they can just simply hang themselves, which is what they're going to do if they're left to it. And then you're right, Israel is such a wild card. God only knows what the fanatical Israeli leadership is capable of doing, but it seems to me that they're fully capable of doing what you say. Because, if they have no qualms about killing 200,000 Palestinians in Gaza,
Yeah.
then there are no limits. There are no limits. There are no qualms. There are no ethical considerations. There are no strategic considerations.
No, and if you bring in the religious zealotry, there's actually an incentive to create Armageddon.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
We can't forget that aspect of it as well, because you mentioned Ben Gvir, you mentioned Smotrich, all of them are adherents of the Temple Mount movement, which is the creation of an apocalypse to enable the second coming of Christ. And you then have all of the Christian Zionists in the United States, many of them followers of Trump.
Yes. Yes.
So as we've discussed, there are multiple aspects, all of which are leading back to, I wouldn't even say the irrationality of the Zionists, because I don't think they are irrational. I think they're psychopathic, and I think there is absolute depravity in that society. The fact that 65% of Israeli population voted for soldiers that had, carried out anal rape against a Palestinian prisoner should not be prosecuted tells you everything you need to know about this society, right? So yeah, I think you're right. I think the non-aligned axis, Russia, China, Iran, and all of their allies in the region are walking a very dangerous tripwire right now.
Yes.
And I hope people in the West understand the extent to which they are preventing a catastrophe, actually, which is being driven by the Western oligarchs and corporatocracy, and Israel is I wouldn't even say anymore that it's a tool of that entire cartel. I would say now it's become a Frankenstein. It's become, like you said, a rogue monster.
Yes. Well, it was. I don't know if they knew. Yes, you're right. They knew what they were doing, but they didn't. They thought that they would be able to control it because, this was the creation of the Round Table movement. The Milner Group, where Nathan Rothschild was a member, and Lord Balfour was Nathan Rothschild's BFF.
Yeah.
And then Lord Walter Rothschild was the father, to whom the Balfour Declaration was addressed. He was the father of Nathan, and Nathan was spending pretty much every day at the Foreign Office with Lord Balfour. Well, there are written records about their intention to populate the Middle East, so the Palestine, with what they called a particularly patriotic stock. So they wanted these fanatics. They wanted to populate it with fanatically devoted people who are going to be ready to fight and kill and sacrifice themselves and bring the roof in over their heads to make sure that their creation is is not in jeopardy. And so now we're here. Now this is the time when this end game is being played out. And I think that inevitably it ends with this Israel disappearing.
Yeah.
It was in 2012 that Henry Kissinger predicted that 10 years from now, speaking in 2012, there will be no Israel. Well, Henry Kissinger knew a little something about geopolitics and the situation in the region. So he knew what he was talking about. He obviously got the timing wrong because we're 12 years into the game, but now it's becoming discernible that the foundation is being yanked from under Israel. Now, what we have to hope is that people who are in charge of the nukes in Israel, meaning hopefully the military brass, are a bit more humane and rational than people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich and their ilk.
I mean, I know Alistair Crook has been talking about this division between the traditional IOF and the Ben Gvir now has been given control of the border guards, the National Guards, the police, the security, and he has his own militia. Of course, the settlers, the ISIS settlers, that are now under his control and have been heavily armed. And yes, one has to hope. I didn't ever think I would sort of commend the IOF in any way, because of course their history has been extremely brutal also, but that there might be some kind of rational ability to prevent this kind of disaster, because I am really genuinely, I do really think that's a real threat, because we're facing a cornered beast.
Yes,
fully aware that it's cornered also.
But the reason why I hope that there are rational people left is because it was the IDF. It was the IDF that wrote a study for the Israeli cabinet saying if we go and take on Hezbollah, it's going to be a suicide for the IDF and for the state of Israel. And so I think that all of these fanatics who have been absolutely gung-ho of let's go expand the war to the north and let's go attack Hezbollah have obviously been checked in some way, because it hasn't happened yet. So I, these kinds of things give me a little bit of hope that there are grown-ups left in there, that there are rational people there, that there are people who have children and love their children, and that there are people who want to know, who don't want to blow up the whole world because their messianic fantasy is not playing out quite the way they imagine that it should.
I hope so. And I hope, when you talk about these implosions, we are to a degree seeing Israel implode on itself, financially, economically, politically, and so on. that this happens soon, because of course in all of these discussions, you know, I have at the forefront of my mind the fact that we're watching on an hourly basis on social media the slaughter of Palestinians, of children, of entire families. When was it? Last week, when an entire family of 16 members was killed with one bomb. I mean, you know, it's just unfathomable. I mean, I've spent time in Gaza in 2012 in the Israeli aggression, and that was psychotic. I'd never seen anything like it, but I can't imagine. I cannot put myself in the place of those people and understand the minute by minute trauma and terror that they're facing. You know, it's and so for me, I just wish this could all happen tomorrow. You know.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So let's hope. Let's hope that Israel does kind of eat itself from the inside out, because, you know, that would be, there is no going back to anything that might have been possible before, in my opinion. You know, the way forward now is the dismantlement of the Zionist movement and the Zionist state, and the return to one democratic state as it was pre-1917. Called Palestine, where Jews and Christians and atheists and communists and Muslims coexisted peacefully.
Yes, yes, before the British Empire fixed it for us.
Yeah, as it always does, of course, you know.
Yeah, and well, yes, and that, look, Vanessa, I feel optimistic. I mean, you know, accidents can happen, bad things can happen. But I do feel optimistic, because I think that, you know, for the first time ever in the history of mankind, these things are happening with a view to them in the real time. And we have social media, and we're able to have conversations like this. You know, in the past, we literally completely depended on the printed word and radio and television for our understanding of what's going on. And so it was relatively easy for them to, it was dead easy, in fact, for them to control the narrative.
Yeah.
And today, they absolutely do not control the narrative. And they are now up against, you know, British Empire used to be so powerful. There was no even way to oppose them at the time. Now, both the British Empire and their American, how do you call it, henchmen, are have met their match in Russia and China and Iran. And so I think that there's a fair likelihood that things will happen the way that you described them, because I think it's the only way.
Yeah.
It is the only way. The two-state solution is dead. It's never coming back. The only solution possible is one-state solution. These fanatics are going to have to go, and the people who are going to stay are going to have to be prepared to live with their Muslim brothers, with their Christian brothers, with their, as you said, atheist and communist brothers, in peace and harmony. And I think that can happen now. And, you know, the sooner the better, because it's, you know, the traumas that the Palestinians have experienced over the last, you know, not just several months, but 7 decades.
Yeah.
Are irreversible, and it's probably going to take generations for them to be able to flourish again. Well, you know, there are Palestinians in the West Bank, there are Palestinians in Jordan, so who knows? But I think in the long term, it's going to be okay.
I hope so. Let's end on an optimistic note.
Yes, let's end on an optimistic note, and let's pray that it be so.
Yes, exactly, for everybody's sake, because the alternative is really not pleasant to contemplate.
I think the alternative is hell.
Yeah. Yes.
I think the alternative is hell, for us included, you know, because this is, we're all implicated.
Yes. Exactly. Yes, very strong point. Alex, thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure talking to you, and let's not leave it quite such a long time. I know time does fly, and with everything that's happening, you know, you're just running around like a headless chicken, or I am, just trying to
I,
keep up with everything.
yes, I definitely am. I definitely am.
But
Mm.
it's really lovely talking to you and just sort of you know, untangling stuff together and from our different perspectives, trying to, you know, as you said, just brainstorm a way through all of
Yes,
the complications.
yes.
So thank you. I really appreciate
Thank you,
it.
Vanessa.
And
Honored to join you and a privilege. Greetings to all your listeners, and
thank,
uh, and a deep thank you for what you're doing.
and the same to you, Alex. Keep doing it. And we'll speak again very, very soon, hopefully.
Yes, thank you, and take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.